The road to nowhere. The rain struck the window pane like frantic fingertips tapping against the glass, desperate to be heard. 11-year-old Lena sat quietly in the back seat of a worn-out sit-in, her thin fingers twisting the frayed edge of her oversized sweater sleeve. The car smelled faintly of old coffee and damp paper, and the social worker driving, Mrs. Crowley, hadn't said a word in over 20 minutes. The silence was heavy, but Lena had long learned that silence was better than questions. Questions always led to memories, and memories were landmines she had no strength to step on today. This was the fourth home she'd been sent to in just under 2 years. They all blurred together at this point. Brief smiles, stiff introductions, promises that never felt quite real. Foster parents who seemed warm enough on the first day, but cooled into distant strangers the moment the paperwork was signed. But even those places had been houses, some with backyards or second-hand bicycles leaning against the garage walls. This time was different. The car turned down a narrow road, potholes shaking the whole vehicle, and for the first time, Lena saw the place they were headed. Not a house, but something older, larger. Its windows were dark, a few covered with warped wooden shutters. A rusted iron gate stood ajar, barely hanging onto its hinges. It wasn't the kind of place where families lived. It was the kind of place where things were left to be forgotten. Willowridge Home for Girls, the faded sign announced. The letters were chipped and peeling, but the words still carried weight. Lena swallowed hard, her throat dry. The place seemed too still. There were no children's voices echoing from inside, no laughter spilling out from any cracked window. Only the wind answered the rattling of the gate. Mrs. Crowley cleared her throat, glancing at Lena in the rearview mirror. "I know this isn't ideal," she said softly. "But sometimes places like this can surprise you. You might make friends, maybe even feel safe." The words sounded rehearsed, and they landed in Lena's chest like wet leaves, cold and heavy. The car door creaked when Lena opened it, and the rain instantly soaked through her thin sneakers. A single yellow light flickered above the front door, barely bright enough to cut through the dreary mist. As they climbed the uneven concrete steps, Mrs. Crowley reached for the brass knocker, shaped like a snarling lion's face. It clanged loudly, the sound echoing through the house like a warning bell. The door opened with a groan, revealing a tall, thin woman with a pinched face and narrow eyes that flicked up and down Lena's small frame. Her hair was drawn back into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her skin. She wore a long, pale cardigan over a faded floral dress, and the smile she offered was sharp-edged. "You must be Lena." Her voice was high, slightly brittle. "I'm Ms. Holloway, and I run this home." Lena nodded silently, her fingers clutching the strap of her duffel bag. She had only what she could fit in that bag: 2 t-shirts, a pair of jeans, a book with the cover peeling at the edges, and a worn photograph of her mother. The hallway they entered was dim, with a cracked linoleum floor that squelched slightly underfoot. Faintly, Lena caught the scent of something metallic, like old pennies, mingled with bleach and something sour. The air felt thick, like the house itself was holding its breath. A man stood further inside the hall, broad-shouldered and silent, his arms crossed over his chest, his face mostly obscured by a graying beard. His eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp for someone who was supposed to care for children. His gaze lingered on Lena a moment too long. "This is Mr. Holloway," the woman said. "We run this place together." Lena managed a small nod. She had met people like them before, caretakers who liked to remind you they were the ones in charge, the ones who decided if you got an extra blanket or went to bed hungry. As Mrs. Crowley filled out paperwork on the entry table, Lena noticed the other children. They stood further down the hall, partially hidden in the shadow of a narrow doorway. There were only 5 of them, all older than Lena except for one small boy who clung to the leg of a taller girl. Their eyes told her everything she needed to know. They were afraid, not of her, of this place. When the paperwork was finished, Mrs. Crowley knelt down beside Lena, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. "I'll check back in a few weeks, okay?" she said, her voice soft with well-meaning exhaustion. "Just hang in there." Lena nodded, but her stomach churned. They both knew the truth. Foster kids didn't have anyone who came back for them. Once they were placed, the world moved on. The door closed behind Mrs. Crowley, leaving Lena alone in the too-quiet hall with the Halloways. "Come along," Ms. Halloway said briskly. "I'll show you where you'll be sleeping." The stairwell was narrow and steep, the wooden steps worn down in the center from decades of footfalls. The air grew colder as they climbed. Lena's hand grazed the splintered banister, and she wondered how many children had made this climb before her. The room was cramped, just like she expected. 4 beds, all with thin, threadbare blankets. The window was small, nailed shut. The wallpaper peeled at the corners, revealing pale patches of plaster beneath. It didn't matter. Lena had slept in worse places. "Lights out at 9, Miss Halloway said. "You'll get your chores in the morning." Then, without another word, she left, the door closing with a hollow thud. Lena stood there for a moment, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. The other children watched her quietly from their beds. Finally, the taller girl, her hair wild and tangled, stood up and crossed the room. "I'm Maya," she said, her voice low. "How old are you?" 11, Lena replied. Maya's brow furrowed slightly. "You're younger than the rest of us. That's not normal." "Why?" Lena asked. Maya glanced at the door as though it might have ears. "They usually only take older kids, ones they think can work." "Work?" Lena repeated, confused. Maya didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to one of the beds. "That one's yours." Lena placed her bag down, the mattress sagging beneath her slight weight. For a moment, the silence in the room was broken only by the distant ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. The house itself seemed to hum, not with life, but with something darker, heavier. That night, Lena lay awake long after the others had drifted into restless sleep. She could hear the soft creak of footsteps in the hall, the faint rustle of fabric, the click of a lock being checked. The house wasn't just quiet, it was watching. Lena clutched the worn photo of her mother beneath the blanket, whispering to the face she missed more than words could capture. "I'm going to be okay," she whispered to the dark. But the house, the silence, and the fear buried in the walls answered back. "Are you sure?" The weight of silent footsteps. The first morning at Willow Ridge Home for Girls arrived with the metallic clang of an old cowbell, its shrill echo slicing through Lena's uneasy sleep like a blade. She jolted upright, heart hammering. The unfamiliar room, a blur of graying wallpaper and shadows. For a split second, she forgot where she was. Then reality slid back into place like a cold stone. Maya was already out of bed, shoving her feet into worn sneakers without a word. The other girls followed suit, some moving as if still half asleep, others wide-eyed with quiet tension. No one groaned, complained, or stretched lazily like kids usually did when woken too early. They moved with practiced urgency, mechanical, like they knew what would happen if they didn't. Lena fumbled with her shoes, her fingers trembling just slightly. She wanted to ask what they were supposed to do, but the silence in the room was too thick to cut through. Instead, she followed the procession down the stairs, the wood creaking beneath every careful step. The hallway felt colder than last night, the gray light filtering through the windows adding a sickly hue to everything it touched. The dining room was little more than a rectangular table with mismatched chairs, all facing the same direction like pews in a church. At the head stood Mr. Halloway, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze scanning each child as they filed in. "Sit," he ordered, voice low and even, not loud, but the kind of quiet authority that made Lena's stomach clench. The children obeyed without hesitation, sliding into their usual places. A bowl was placed in front of each of them, watery oatmeal with a single slice of bread. There were no spoons. They were expected to eat with their hands. Lena hesitated, but Maya nudged her knee under the table. Don't make them notice you, the silent message seemed to say. She picked up the bread, dipped it into the grayish sludge, and forced herself to swallow. It was cold, bland, and the texture made her stomach turn. But she didn't dare leave it untouched. Beth Halloway swept into the room, wiping her hands on a stained towel. "There's no such thing as free meals here," she said with the false sweetness of a woman who delighted in hidden threats. "Everyone works." Her smile sharpened. "And today, little Lena, we'll find out if you're worth keeping." Lena's stomach clenched so hard she thought she might throw up the oatmeal, but she kept her face blank. Mrs. Crowley's words echoed faintly in her mind. "Maybe even feel safe." What a joke. Breakfast ended without conversation. The children filed outside into the chilly morning air. The sky was a dull slate gray, the grass wet with dew, and the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and something Lena couldn't quite place, something faintly metallic, like rusted iron or blood. The backyard was larger than it had appeared from the front, stretching out toward a line of trees that formed a natural border. Clotheslines sagged under the weight of damp laundry, and a weathered barn stood near the edge of the property, its paint peeled away to reveal the bones beneath. Lena was paired with Maya, and a boy named Joel, who couldn't have been more than 12, but had the gaunt, hollow look of someone who had already given up hope. Together, they were tasked with scrubbing the barn floor, a task that sounded simple until Lena saw the sheer thickness of the mud and grime caked across the wood. A rusted metal bucket was shoved into her hands, the handle biting into her skin. "Water's out back," Beth said, her smile thin. "Don't spill any. Water costs money." Lena trudged to the outdoor spigot, Joel trailing silently behind her. The handle squealed in protest as she turned it, water sputtering out in bursts before settling into a steady trickle. Joel held out his bucket, his hands trembling just slightly. "How long have you been here?" Lena asked softly, afraid her voice might shatter the fragile silence. Joel didn't answer at first. His eyes darted toward the house, then back down to the bucket. "A year," he whispered. "Is it always like this?" Joel gave a slight nod, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Sometimes worse." Lena wanted to ask what worse meant, but the words lodged in her throat. Something about the way Joel stood, shoulders hunched, gaze lowered, made her afraid to know the answer. They hauled the heavy buckets back into the barn, where Maya was already scrubbing a dark stain near the center of the floor. The bristles of her brush were worn to uneven nubs, and her knuckles were raw and red. Lena knelt beside her, plunging her brush into the water and scrubbing with all the strength her wiry arms could muster. The water turned brown almost instantly, but the stain didn't budge. "Don't ask what it is," Maya muttered without looking up. "You don't want to know." Lena swallowed hard and kept scrubbing. Hours passed, the work relentless. No breaks, no laughter, no sense of time except for the slow crawl of the sun behind the clouds. The only voices were those of the Halloways, barking orders, correcting the children's posture, or criticizing their speed. By the time they were called inside for lunch, Lena's arms ached so badly she could barely lift them. Lunch was the same as breakfast. Thin broth, a crust of bread, silence. The afternoon brought more chores, scrubbing windows, hauling firewood, wiping down the mildewed walls of the cellar. Every step was watched, every breath seemed monitored. And every time Mr. Halloway's eyes lingered on one of the children too long, Lena's skin crawled. She wanted to scream, wanted to demand why. Why were they treated like this? Why wasn't anyone stopping it? But even at 11, Lena understood the truth. The world didn't care about girls like her. Forgotten girls. Girls with no families, no money, no future. That night, after lights out, she lay awake again, the room filled with the sound of slow, measured breathing. The air felt thick with secrets, and every creak of the house made her heart race. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened. Heavy footsteps moved past their room, slow and deliberate. Lena turned her face toward the wall, trying to pretend she was asleep. The footsteps paused outside their door, just for a moment, before moving on. She didn't know where they were going, or who they were coming for, but she knew one thing for certain. There was no safety here. There was no comfort, only survival. Lena clenched her hands beneath the blanket, nails digging into her palms, and whispered the only promise she knew how to make. I won't become like them. I won't let them break me. A house creaked in reply, as though it had heard that promise before. The sound of breaking chains. The rain returned the following morning, thin and cold like a whisper brushing against the windows. A fog hung low over the grounds of Willowridge, curling around the fence posts like ghostly fingers trying to pull the house under. The children worked in silence, their clothes sticking to their skin, fingers numb from the cold water in the laundry basins. Lena's hands were raw and red, the skin cracking in places where soap and cold had worn it thin. But the pain wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. Silence weighed heavier than any chore, thicker than the damp fog, pressing into her bones. There were no stories told between children, no whispered games to pass the time, no laughter. It was as if laughter had been scrubbed out of them. Just like the floors, just like the windows. It had been 3 days since she arrived, and already she knew. This wasn't a home. It was a machine, and the children were just its gears. Turning, breaking, being replaced. Lena carried a basket of wet sheets toward the clothesline, her small shoulders bowing under its weight. As she walked, she felt eyes on her, not the other children's, but from the house itself. From windows too high for anyone to stand in, from doorways no one stood behind. She felt watched, as though the house itself was memorizing her, deciding whether she would survive or shatter. Near the edge of the property, the barn loomed. The barn was a place none of the children spoke about directly, but whenever someone was told to clean inside it, their face would pale, and they'd return quieter than before, as though something inside had reached into their chests and taken a piece of them. Lena had not yet been inside the barn, but she knew her turn was coming. The barn's secret. It came after dinner, a watery stew with chunks of potato and limp carrot floating on top. The children ate quickly, eyes down, bowls held carefully to avoid spilling. There were never second servings, no matter how hollow your stomach felt. Lena, Beth Holloway's voice rang out from the doorway, falsely sweet, her smile stretched too tight. You'll be helping Mr. Holloway in the barn after supper. Lena's fingers tightened around her spoon, but she didn't lift her gaze. From across the table, Maya's head shot up, her knuckles white around her bowl. Lena saw the fear in her eyes. Fear and something worse. Pity. Lena didn't ask why. Questions didn't matter here. Orders were given, and you obeyed. Or you paid. The barn door groaned as it swung open, the hinges rusted from years of neglect. The smell hit her first, not just hay and dirt, but something thicker beneath it. Rot, dampness, the unmistakable copper tang of old blood. Mr. Holloway stood in the doorway, his shadow spilling across the threshold, cutting off the last sliver of daylight. Inside, he said, voice low. Lena stepped over the threshold, every nerve screaming at her to run. The barn was dim, the only light coming from a single dangling bowl swaying gently overhead. The floor was damp in places, the wood dark and warped. Old tools hung along the walls. Saws, rusted scythes, hammers, relics from some forgotten time when the barn had a purpose other than fear. Start with the floor, Mr. Holloway said, tossing a filthy brush at her feet. Scrub it clean. Lena knelt, her knees sinking into something slick. The brush was heavy, and her hand shook as she dragged it across the wood. Streaks of brown and red rose from the planks, the smell growing stronger the more she scrubbed. Mr. Holloway stood over her, his boots scuffing the floor, his breath slow and measured. He didn't speak, but Lena could feel his eyes, watching every stroke of the brush, every twitch of her hands. She wanted to scream. She wanted to ask why. Why this place was like this, why the other children were so afraid, Why no one came to check, to see, to save them. But she had learned long ago that why didn't matter. Survive. That was the only rule. The first scar. By the time she was released from the barn, the moon hung low in the sky. A thin crescent slashed through the clouds. Her hands were swollen, fingers stiff, knees aching. But worse than all of it was the small cut on the inside of her wrist, from a nail jutting from the floor, a nail she hadn't seen in the dark. It was shallow, barely bleeding, but it felt deeper. It felt like the first piece of her being claimed by Willowridge. When she climbed back into bed that night, Maya sat up, her voice barely a whisper. "What did he make you do?" "Scrub," Lena whispered back. Maya exhaled slowly. "Just that." Lena nodded, and Maya's shoulders sagged with something like relief. But her face was still pale, her hands twisting the edge of her blanket. Lena didn't ask what else might happen in the barn. She didn't want to know. The unwritten rules. The next morning, after the bell clanged, Maya slipped a small piece of paper into Lena's hand while they were hauling water to the kitchen. It was damp and crumpled, the edges smudged with dirt, but the words were still legible. The 5 rules of Willowridge. Don't speak unless spoken to. Never look Mr. Halloway in the eye. If Beth smiles too much, be afraid. The barn remembers. No one escapes. Lena's stomach twisted as she read them. The rules didn't come from the Halloways. They came from the children themselves, a survival guide, passed down from ghost to ghost. That night, after the others fell asleep, Lena lay awake staring at the ceiling. The rules felt like a death sentence, each one cutting off another path to freedom. But something inside her, something that had survived 4 foster homes and endless broken promises, refused to die. No one escapes. That was a lie. Someone would. Someone had to. The first spark. Over the next few days, Lena began to see the cracks. Small things. The loose window frame in the upstairs hall, the rusted lock on the cellar door, the way the back gate hung just slightly askew. Places where the house wasn't as strong as it pretended to be. She started listening too. Not just to the Halloways, but to the silences between their footsteps. The gaps in their routines. The times when Mr. Halloway stepped out for his cigarettes or Beth locked herself in the office with the phone cord wrapped around her fingers. There were cracks in the walls. All she needed was to be brave enough to slip through them. The words that changed everything. It happened late one night, after the house had gone still. Lena was sneaking down to the kitchen for a cup of water when she heard it. Beth's voice, low and urgent, speaking into the phone. "They're asking too many questions," she said. "The caseworker's coming again next week. We can't have another incident. You know what to do." A pause. Then the words that froze Lena in place. "No one ever finds out." Lena didn't know who Beth was speaking to, but she knew one thing. It wasn't about chores. It wasn't about running a home. It was about secrets. Secrets that could break the Halloways if anyone ever found them. Lena's fingers curled into fists. If the house was made of secrets, she would tear it apart brick by brick. Whispers beneath the floorboards. The days in Willowridge stretched like a thin wire pulled tight, trembling under the weight of too much silence, too much fear. Lena counted the hours not by a clock, but by the rhythm of footsteps. Beth's sharp heels tapping along the hallways, Mr. Halloway's heavy boots dragging across the floor like anchors scraping the seabed. Each day blurred into the next. Chores, silence, empty meals. A world that shrank until the only reality was the house, the barn, and the unyielding walls between. But Lena was learning. She was watching. Each day, she mapped the house inside her mind. Every creak in the floorboards, every crack in the plaster, every loose latch on every window. The house wasn't indestructible. It only pretended to be. The house might have been watching her, but she was watching it back. The night watcher. It started 3 nights after she heard Beth's whispered phone call. Lena couldn't sleep. Her mattress was too thin. the blanket too short, and the shadows too thick. Her mind circled around those words. No one ever finds out. She thought about what could be hidden in a house like this. Was it just the endless labor, the bruises on Maya's arms, the cracked knuckles on Joel's hands? Or was there something deeper, something beneath the floorboards, something behind the locked doors no one ever talked about? The house had too many locked doors, and the silence felt too practiced. Lena slipped out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, every step carefully measured to avoid the squeaky spots she had memorized over the last few days. Maya shifted in her sleep but didn't wake, curled in on herself like a small animal protecting its heart. Lena moved to the window at the end of the hallway, the one overlooking the barn. The sky was thick with clouds, but a single beam of moonlight cut through the gloom, striking the ground behind the barn. And there, just for a moment, Lena saw it. A figure, small, slight, a child. The figure crept from the side of the barn, barefoot, moving like a ghost. Their hair hung in tangled clumps, and even from the second floor, Lena could see the trembling in their hands. The child, a girl, maybe younger than Lena, reached the fence, pressing her fingers against the wood. She was trying to climb. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen this girl before. Not at meals, not during chores, not in any of the dorm rooms. Who was she? Before the girl could get a foothold, the back door to the house burst open. Mr. Holloway. He moved faster than Lena had ever seen, his boots pounding across the dirt. The girl froze, caught halfway up the fence. For a heartbeat, Lena thought the man might simply grab her and drag her back inside. But he didn't. His hand shot out, grabbing the girl by her hair and yanking her down so hard she crumpled to the ground. A muffled cry echoed up to Lena's window. Quick, strangled, then silence. The girl didn't move again. Mr. Holloway stood over her, breathing heavily, before bending down and lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all. Without a word, he carried her into the barn. The doors slammed shut behind them. Lena pressed both hands over her mouth to keep from screaming. The hidden ones. The next morning, the world at Willow Ridge continued as if nothing had happened. Breakfast was served, watery oatmeal and stale bread. The chores were handed out. Beth smiled her thin, sharp smile. Mr. Holloway's boots dragged across the floor in their usual rhythm. But Lena couldn't stop seeing the girl. The way her arms had hung limp at her sides. The way her hair covered her face. The way Mr. Holloway carried her like she wasn't even a person anymore. Lena wanted to ask Maya, to whisper, who was she? What happened to her? But fear held the words tight inside her throat. Even Maya, as brave as she sometimes pretended to be, had learned to swallow her fear like poison. The unwritten rules were clear. Don't talk about the missing ones. Don't ask where they went. Don't wonder if they'll come back. But Lena couldn't stop wondering. The whispering floor. It was during her afternoon chore, scrubbing the floor in the storage room near the back of the house, that she found it. The whisper. She had been on her hands and knees, dragging the brush back and forth across the floorboards, her mind numb to the motion. The room smelled of damp wood and old dust, the walls lined with shelves stacked with boxes no one ever seemed to open. Her brush caught on something. A seam between two boards, a small gap, so narrow it might have been invisible if the light hadn't hit it just right. Curious, Lena set down the brush and ran her fingers over the gap. The board moved. It was loose. She glanced at the door. Half open, the hallway empty, then carefully pried the board up. It lifted with barely a sound, revealing a small dark space beneath. Inside, there was a scrap of paper. She pulled it out, her fingers shaking, and unfolded it. The paper was crumpled, damp at the edges, but the words were still clear. They take us when we're too slow, when we get sick, when they think no one will notice. The barn isn't for chores. The barn is where we disappear. Please, if you find this, don't let them take you too. The note wasn't signed, Lena's heart pounded so hard, she thought Beth might hear it from the kitchen. The barn. The barn wasn't just for scrubbing floors and hauling wood. The barn was where the children disappeared. The first spark of fire. That night, after the lights were out and the house was still, Lena couldn't sleep. Her hands clutched the note so tightly it crinkled in her fist, the words burning into her skin. Don't let them take you too. She had been in foster homes where people yelled. She had been in houses where no one looked at her. She had even been in places where people hit. But this was different. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was something calculated, something planned. This was a system. And systems could be broken. Lena didn't know how yet, but she knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, someone who hadn't been broken yet, someone who could still see a way out. In the dim moonlight, she turned to Maya's bed. "Maya," she whispered. Maya didn't stir. Lena crept closer, her heart thundering. "Maya," she said again, a little louder. Maya's eyes fluttered open, wide and panicked until she saw Lena's face. "What?" she whispered, voice hoarse with sleep. "I found something," Lena said, her voice trembling. "I need to show you." Maya sat up, her brow furrowed. Now. Together, they huddled under the thin blanket, Lena's fingers shaking as she held out the note. Maya read it, her face pale and set. "I knew it," Maya whispered. "I knew kids didn't just leave. We have to do something," Lena said, her voice fiercer than she felt. Maya's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "If we don't, we're next." They had no plan, no tools, no help, but they had each other. And sometimes, 2 sparks are enough to start a fire. Beneath the bones of the house, the air inside Willow Ridge felt heavier after Lena and Maya found the note. Every breath felt like it carried the weight of the children who had lived and vanished before them. The house was no longer just a prison. It was a predator, waiting patiently for the next weak one to falter. And Lena was certain her name was at the top of its list. The next morning dawned gray and swollen with fog. The world outside the orphanage had disappeared into thick mist, and the cold seeped through every crack in the walls. Lena shivered, but it wasn't just from the cold. It was the knowledge that the barn wasn't just a place for punishment or labor. It was where the house fed. Maya had said little after reading the note, but her silence carried more weight than words. Something inside her had snapped into focus. There was no more pretending they could outlast this place. Survival meant escape. But escaping Willow Ridge wasn't just about slipping through a window or dodging Beth's watchful gaze. It meant exposing the truth. And the truth, Lena suspected, was buried beneath the barn. The first dig. At midday, Beth assigned Lena and Maya to clear out old tools from the barn's lower storage area, a crawl space beneath the main floor that no one had been allowed into before. The timing felt too deliberate, too convenient after what they had discovered. Lena's stomach churned as they stood at the barn doors, the warped wood stained with dark patches that rain had failed to wash away. Maya stood beside her, arms crossed tightly, her breath visible in the cold air. "Do you think they know?" Lena whispered. "Not yet," Maya replied. "But they will." Inside the barn, the sour smell of damp earth and rusted metal hung in the air. The light filtering through the high windows was dim, casting long shadows that seemed to shift when no one was looking. A trapdoor near the back had been left open, its metal ring handle rusted, the wood around it scarred with scratches. Beth stood by the door, arms crossed. "Don't come out until the whole area is clean," she said, her smile too wide. "If you find anything interesting, you'll let me know." The trapdoor yawned open at their feet. Maya stepped down first, her hand on the splintered edge for balance. Lena followed, the air turning colder with every step. The dirt floor was uneven, damp, and smelled faintly of mildew and something sweeter, something that made Lena's stomach turn. They were underground now, in a cramped space no larger than a bedroom. Wooden beams sagged overhead, and the walls were lined with broken crates and rusted farming tools. But it wasn't the tools that caught Lena's attention. It was the floor. There were patches where the dirt was darker, looser, as if someone had recently disturbed it. In one corner, there was a shallow depression, no wider than a child's body. "Help me," Lena whispered, already dropping to her knees. Maya hesitated only a moment before joining her. Together, they began to dig, their fingers clawing at the soft earth. The dirt was cold and damp, sticking to their skin. With each handful, Lena's heart pounded louder. They dug until their fingers hit something solid. Fabric. Lena froze. Maya's breath hitched. Together, they peeled back the dirt, revealing a small bundle wrapped in a sheet, old, stained, and tied with rough twine. Lena's fingers trembled as she untied the knot. The sheet fell away, and beneath it lay a doll. At first, Lena almost laughed, the burst of terror-soaked relief making her dizzy. But then she saw the doll's face, its plastic eyes gouged out, its fabric hands sewn together. A piece of paper was tucked into the doll's chest. Maya took it with shaking hands and unfolded it. "One by one they go, beneath the barn where no one knows. If you find me, leave or join me below." The paper was damp and smudged, but the message was clear. Lena sat back, heart racing, her hands covered in dirt. "It's a warning," she whispered. "It's a grave marker," Maya said quietly. "That's where they're buried." The missing names. That night, after the house had gone still, Lena and Maya sat huddled under the blanket in their shared room. The note from the crawlspace lay between them, the edges curling with dampness. "How many do you think there were?" Lena whispered. Maya stared at the ceiling. "I don't know, but remember the stories." Lena shook her head. Every time someone vanished, Beth told the others they'd been adopted suddenly. No visitors, no goodbyes, just gone. Lena's breath caught in her throat. "You believed her." "We wanted to." Maya's voice cracked. "It was easier to believe they got out." Lena thought of the girl she'd seen by the fence, the way Mr. Halloway had grabbed her, the way she'd disappeared into the barn. Had she already been buried beneath it? Or was she still there somewhere, waiting? "We need proof," Lena whispered. Maya's head turned sharply. "What?" "If we're going to escape, really escape, we have to show someone what's happening here. They'll cover it up if we just run." Maya hesitated. "How?" Lena's mind raced. The barn was the key. The buried secrets, the hidden crawl spaces. If they could document what they found, someone would have to believe them. "We need a camera." Maya almost laughed. "Where are we supposed to get a camera?" Lena frowned, thinking. She remembered something, a faint memory from her second foster home, where her foster brother had a digital camera he wasn't supposed to have, tucked away in the back of a dresser drawer. "Sometimes," Lena said slowly, "when kids get taken, they leave things behind. What if one of them left something we could use?" Maya's eyes widened. The locked room. At the end of the hall was a room none of the children were ever allowed to enter. Beth called it storage, but everyone knew it was where they dumped the belongings of children who disappeared. If they could get inside, the risk. The next day, Lena paid attention to Beth's keys, the long brass ring that jingled from her waist. She memorized the rhythm of her movements. How she set the keys down in the kitchen after breakfast. How she left them unattended for just long enough when she went to answer the phone. That afternoon, while the other children were in the yard, Lena slipped into the kitchen, heart hammering so loudly she thought it would shake the walls. The keys sat on the counter, next to a chipped mug of tea. Her fingers closed around the cold metal. She didn't breathe until she was back upstairs, keys in hand, Maya waiting by the locked door at the end of the hall. The lock was old, stiff. The key scraped against the inside of the mechanism, loud enough to make them both wince. The door creaked open. The room smelled like dust, old paper, and something else, something sour and faintly rotten. Boxes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, some labeled with names. Liam, Grace, Sophia, Daniel. Names of children neither of them had ever met. Maya dug through the boxes, hands shaking. Old clothes, toys, sketchbooks filled with drawings of faceless figures, and locked doors. And near the bottom of one box, a small digital camera. The screen was cracked, but the battery light flickered on when Lena pressed the button. "It still works," Lena whispered. "Now we just need to show the world," Maya said. They had a plan now. They had proof. But the house was listening. And it wasn't done with them yet. The walls remember every cry. The camera sat heavy in Lena's hands, its cracked screen flickering faintly, a fragile window into the secrets buried inside Willow Ridge Home for Girls. Dust coated its edges, the buttons worn smooth from fingers that had once held it tightly, fingers belonging to a child who had vanished before Lena ever arrived. Lena's breath came in short, sharp bursts as she turned it over, half expecting it to crumble in her hands. But it didn't. It was still here, waiting, just like the truth. Maya hovered by the door, her eyes darting back and forth down the empty hall. "How do we get the pictures out?" she whispered. Lena's fingers trembled as she pressed the power button. The camera hummed softly, the screen illuminating their faces in pale, ghostly light. She navigated the menus with growing dread. There were already photos stored inside. The first picture was of the yard, fog curling around the clotheslines. The second was the barn door, cracked open just enough to show a sliver of darkness inside. The third was a picture of a girl's hand pressed against a dirty window, fingers thin and trembling, streaked with mud and blood. Lena's stomach turned. The images continued. Photos of bruised legs, of scraps of paper with desperate messages scrawled on them, of the inside of the crawl space beneath the barn floor where Lena and Maya had found the doll. The last photo made her throat tighten so hard she couldn't breathe. It was a selfie, taken by a girl with hollow eyes and sunken cheeks, her lips cracked but curled in the faintest, bravest smile. On her palm, held up to the camera, were 5 words written in thick black marker. "Please don't forget about me." Lena's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the camera. The girl was gone, but her plea was still here, trapped inside this tiny piece of plastic and glass. Lena felt the weight of it pressed down on her chest, the weight of every child who had stood where she stood now, who had hoped for someone to see them before the house swallowed them whole. "We have to get out," Lena whispered. Maya's breath was shaky, but her voice was steady. "We need more than just pictures." Lena nodded, wiping her sweaty palms against her skirt. "We need proof of the barn, beneath the skin of the house." That night, the fog returned, curling thick around the house like a shroud. The darkness outside the windows was so complete it felt solid, pressing against the glass as if it wanted inside. Lena lay awake, the camera clutched tightly to her chest beneath her blanket. Somewhere down the hall, a door creaked. Footsteps passed their door, heavy boots, slow and measured. Mr. Halloway was doing his rounds, his shadow sliding under the door like an oil slick. As soon as the footsteps faded, Lena slipped out of bed. Maya followed, her breath loud in the silence. Together, they crept down the hall, every floorboard memorized, every step a prayer. The back door creaked when they opened it, the night air biting at their skin. The barn loomed in the fog, its crooked silhouette blurred like a fading memory. They didn't speak as they crossed the yard, mud sucking at their bare feet. The barn door was closed, but the latch was rusted, easy to pry open with trembling fingers. Inside, the air was thick with rot and earth, a living thing, damp and breathing. Lena raised the camera, the tiny flash throwing shadows against the walls. The beam illuminated the stains, dark patches on the floor, too old to be water, too uneven to be paint. She snapped photos. The floor, the tools crusted with something she didn't want to name, the trapdoor to the crawl space hanging half open. Maya stood guard, her back pressed to the wall, her fingers twitching against her sides. "Hurry," she whispered. Lena climbed down into the crawl space, her breath catching as the earth swallowed her. The dirt floor was uneven, the air stale and close. The light from the camera flash revealed more bundles, half buried beneath loose soil. Some were wrapped in cloth, others simply hidden beneath thin layers of dirt. Each was the size of a child. Lena's stomach rolled, bile rising in her throat. These were the ones who hadn't made it, the ones who had been forgotten. She snapped photos as fast as she could, hands shaking so badly the images blurred. But they were clear enough to show the world, clear enough to prove the truth. Footsteps in the dark. A floorboard creaked above. Lena froze, heart hammering against her ribs. Another creak, and then a voice. Low, rough, slurred with sleep or anger. "Mr. Holloway." The barn door slammed shut. Maya's strangled whisper echoed down through the trapdoor. "Lena, he's here." Lena shoved the camera into her pocket, scrambling up the ladder, her knees scraping against the splintered wood. She barely made it out before a hand closed around her wrist. "Thought you'd sneak around, huh?" Mr. Holloway's voice was thick with menace, breath sour with stale alcohol. His fingers dug into her skin, yanking her off the ladder. "You brats never learn." Maya lunged at him, her fists pounding against his arm. "Let her go." He shoved her aside like she weighed nothing. Maya hit the floor hard, gasping for breath. "You want to know what happens to nosy little rats?" Mr. Holloway hissed, dragging Lena toward the back of the barn. "I'll show you." He hauled open the trapdoor, and Lena saw the earth yawning open beneath her feet. "You'll join the others. No one will even miss you." The world tilted, dirt and darkness rushing up to swallow her whole. But Lena fought. She kicked, her heel connecting with Mr. Holloway's shin, surprising him enough that his grip loosened. She twisted free, scrambling toward Maya. "Run!" she screamed. Maya's legs shook, but she obeyed, bolting for the door. Lena followed, her lungs burning, Mr. Holloway's footsteps thundering behind them. The fog swallowed them the moment they hit the yard, but they didn't stop. Behind them, Beth's voice rang out from the house, shrill with fury. "Get them. Don't let them leave." The front gate was ahead, so close, yet so far. The lock was rusted, the chain old. Lena's fingers trembled as she fumbled with it, the metal slick with rain. "Come on," Maya whispered desperately. The footsteps grew louder. The chain gave way. The gate swung open. They ran. The road to freedom. They didn't stop until they reached the main road, a cracked strip of asphalt that stretched into the fog. The house was a distant smear behind them, the fog swallowing its shape. Lena's chest heaved, her fingers still curled around the camera. "We did it," she whispered, her voice barely there. Maya wiped her face with trembling hands. Now what? Lena didn't know. But headlights appeared in the distance, faint at first, then brighter, cutting through the mist. A car. A police car. They stumbled into the road, waving their arms, their voices hoarse. The car slowed, tires crunching over wet gravel. The window rolled down, and a familiar face stared back at them. Officer Mike. His eyes widened. "Lena?" Lena burst into tears. After the storm, the investigation that followed shattered the silence that had protected Willow Ridge for so long. The photos, the crawl space, the graves. It was undeniable. Beth and Mr. Holloway were arrested, the house condemned, the surviving children placed in safe homes. But even after the trials, after the news crews left, Lena carried the house with her. The faces in the photos, the voices in the walls, the handprints left in the dirt beneath the barn. Not all scars are visible, but neither is courage. Lena never forgot. And she never let the world forget either. For every child the world abandoned, Lena remembered. And remembering is sometimes the bravest thing of all.